He returned from war expecting victory songs and celebration, but found his entire world dead except for the one person he'd sworn to kill. What happened next would test every belief Thiago had ever held about honor, revenge, and the true meaning of sacrifice in ways that would echo through the Amazon itself and reshape the destiny of every tribe that called the Great Forest home. This is the story of a choice that would either save the last survivors of a plague or damn them all to slavery under foreign masters who saw indigenous souls as nothing more than labor for their gold mines and sugar plantations. The morning sun painted the Amazon canopy in shades of gold and crimson as Thiago pushed through the familiar trails that led home to his village, his bare feet finding purchase on paths worn smooth by countless generations of Ticuna warriors before him. The very stones seemed to recognize his footsteps, welcoming back the son of chiefs and shamans who had walked these same routes for over 300 years. Spider monkeys chattered in the distance, their calls a familiar symphony that should have brought comfort, but now only reminded him of how alone he was in the world. Butterflies the size of his palm danced through shafts of morning light, their iridescent wings catching rainbows that seemed to mock his dark mood with their beauty. His war paint had long since faded during the 3-month campaign against the Yowalapiti raiders, leaving only faint traces of the sacred designs that had once marked him as one of the Thunder Spear Regiment's most feared killers. His muscular body bore the scars of 17 battles fought in defense of tribal honor, each mark a story of victory, each line a testament to survival against impossible odds. The Thunder Spear Regiment had been decimated during their final assault on the enemy stronghold, reduced from 50 elite warriors to just him, the sole survivor of what should have been their greatest triumph. He could still hear their death cries echoing in his memory, still see the faces of brothers in arms who had fought beside him since childhood. Manu, who could track a jaguar through 3 days of rain and navigate by stars invisible to other eyes. Coram, whose war songs could inspire courage in the most cowardly heart, and whose voice could carry battle orders across an entire battlefield. Yaku, the master of poisons, whose arrows never failed to find their mark, and whose knowledge of deadly plants had saved them countless times. Boro, the youngest at 19, who could move through the forest like a ghost, and whose laughter had kept their spirits alive during the darkest moments of the campaign. All gone now, their bodies left to feed the vultures on a battlefield far from home, their souls wandering the spirit paths without proper burial rites to guide them to the ancestors. Each death had torn a piece from Thiago's heart, until he wondered if anything remained but scar tissue and the hollow echo of what love used to sound like. He had carried their weapons home, Manu's favorite spear, Coram's war club, Yaku's poison-making kit, planning to honor them in the traditional ceremony where fallen warriors' spirits are released to join their ancestors. But victory felt hollow when you had no brothers left to share it with, no family waiting to welcome you home with pride, burning in their eyes like sacred fires. The weight of being the last pressed down on him like the entire forest canopy, each step toward home heavier than the last, each breath a reminder that he alone carried the memories of 50 warriors who would never see another sunrise. The victory songs he had planned to sing felt like ashes in his throat. The acrid smell hit him first, carried on the morning breeze like a messenger from the underworld, announcing the end of all things. Smoke, but wrong somehow, too sweet, too heavy with the scent of death and decay that made his warrior instincts scream warnings that came too late to matter. This wasn't the clean smoke of cooking fires or ceremonial tobacco, wasn't the familiar scent of burning wood and roasting meat that should have welcomed him home. This was the smell of a world ending, of everything he had ever loved turning to ash and memory, of innocence burning away to reveal the cruel bones of reality underneath. The wind carried other scents too, the sickly sweet odor of rotting flesh, the metallic tang of spilled blood, the sharp chemical smell that meant disease had claimed the living. His scarred hand moved instinctively to the obsidian war club at his side, fingers wrapping around the leather grip that had seen more blood than most men see in 10 lifetimes. The weapon had been his grandfather's, and his grandfather's before that, passed down through generations of Thunderspear warriors who had never known defeat. Its black surface gleamed with the spiritual power of countless victories, each battle adding to its strength, each enemy's blood feeding its hunger for justice. But he sensed this enemy was different, invisible, merciless, beyond the reach of any weapon forged by human hands. As he crested the hill that overlooked his village, the same hill where he had played as a child, where he had first learned to throw a spear, where he had said goodbye to his mother before leaving for war, Thiago's world shattered like pottery dropped on stone. The sight below him was so far from what he had expected that his mind struggled to process it, rejecting the reality that spread out before him like a nightmare made manifest in daylight. But the truly shocking thing was what he found in the center of the destruction, where once stood the proud longhouses of the Ticuna people. Now only blackened husks remained, their palm-thatch roofs collapsed into smoking piles of ash and bone. The central plaza where children had once played and elders had shared stories was now a graveyard of memories, littered with the remnants of lives cut short by something far more terrible than enemy arrows. Bodies lay scattered throughout the settlement like broken dolls thrown by an angry child. Men, women, children, elders, all claimed by something that showed no mercy, respected no age, honored no innocence. Their skin was mottled with dark lesions that spoke of a disease beyond the healing knowledge of their shamans, their faces twisted in the agony of their final moments. The plague had come while he was away, and it had shown no mercy to the people he had sworn to protect. Even the dogs were dead, their loyal bodies lying beside their masters as if they had chosen to follow them into the spirit world rather than live alone among the ruins. The chickens that had provided eggs for morning meals lay scattered like feathers in the wind. The tame parrots that had learned to speak Ticuna words were silent forever, their bright colors faded to gray in death. Thiago stumbled down the hill, his warrior's composure cracking like dry earth under the weight of absolute loss. Each step revealed new horrors that cut deeper than any blade, the toys his nephew had carved scattered in the dirt beside his small, still body. The loom where his sister had woven the ceremonial sash he wore into battle, now broken and stained with blood that had dried to the color of rust. The garden where his mother had grown healing herbs, now choked with weeds and death. The medicinal plants withered as if the very earth had lost its will to nurture life. His mother's house, the place where he had been born, where she had taught him the ancient songs, where she had painted his first war designs with trembling hands as he prepared to leave for his first battle, was nothing but charred timber and memories turned to smoke. His sister's family home, where laughter had once echoed from dawn to dusk, now held only silence and the small, still forms of children who would never grow to become warriors or shamans or storytellers. His father's ceremonial lodge, where the elders once gathered to smoke sacred tobacco and plan hunts, where the wisdom of countless generations had been shared in whispered councils under the light of eternal fires, now just another pile of ash where dreams went to die. The sacred fire pit, which had burned continuously for 300 years, tended by an unbroken line of firekeepers who had passed the responsibility from father to son, like a living prayer. Cold now, its eternal flame extinguished along with the lives of everyone who had known its secrets and understood its sacred significance to their people's survival. He fell to his knees beside what had once been the central fire pit, where his people had danced during harvest celebrations and sung stories passed down through countless generations of Ticuna warriors. Now it was just cold stone surrounded by the bones of everything he had ever loved, everything that had given his life meaning and purpose. The weight of being the last pressed down on him like the entire forest itself had collapsed onto his shoulders, crushing him with the knowledge that he was now the sole keeper of 1,000 years of tradition and memory. That's when he heard the coughing, weak, labored, but unmistakably human. At this very moment, everything Thiago thought he knew about justice was about to change forever. The sound came from the medicine lodge, the only structure still partially intact, its thick walls having somehow resisted both fire and time. The building where his grandmother had taught him which plants could heal and which could kill, where the shamans had once prepared warriors for battle with sacred visions and protective chants that connected them to the spirit world. Thiago drew his war club, muscle memory taking over as he approached the sound of labored breathing. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Someone had survived the plague that had claimed everyone else, but who could possibly have the strength or knowledge to resist what had killed an entire village of strong, healthy people? But as he pushed aside the hanging mat that served as a door, his blood turned to ice water in his veins, and his heart stopped beating for what felt like eternity. The sight that greeted him was so impossible, so beyond anything his warrior's mind had prepared for, that he wondered if the spirits were playing some cruel joke on his already shattered soul. Sitting cross-legged in the center of the lodge, tending a small fire with hands that shook from illness, was the last man on earth Thiago ever expected to see alive. Jaguar. The name fell from his lips like a curse spoken by dying shamans, like a prayer offered to vengeful spirits, like the sound a man makes when his heart is torn from his chest and held beating before his eyes. Jaguar, the Yanomami war chief who had led the raid on their fishing camp 8 years ago, when Thiago was still young and believed the world was a place where good triumphed and justice prevailed. Jaguar, who had personally put a spear through Thiago's younger brother's heart while the 16-year-old boy begged for mercy in 3 different languages. Jaguar, whose scarred face had haunted Thiago's dreams every night for nearly a decade, fueling his transformation from peaceful hunter into the Amazon's most feared warrior. The man whose death he had planned in excruciating detail, whose suffering he had imagined with the creativity of someone whose hatred had been refined by years of careful cultivation. Every scar on Thiago's body had been earned in battles fought with Jaguar's face in his mind. Every skill he had mastered had been honed with the singular purpose of one day standing over his enemy's corpse. The enemy chief looked up with eyes that held no fear, only the calm acceptance of a man who had already walked through hell and emerged on the other side. The plague had ravaged him too. Dark lesions covered his arms and chest like the marks of spiritual punishment, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps that spoke of lungs slowly drowning in their own fluids. But he was alive, somehow holding death at bay through sheer force of will, or perhaps through the intervention of spirits who found amusement in cosmic irony. His once powerful frame had been reduced to skin and bone, the muscles that had once wielded war clubs with deadly precision now wasted away to nothing. The geometric tattoos that covered his body, each one representing a life taken in battle, a village burned, a family destroyed, seemed to mock him now, reminders of power that disease had stripped away as easily as removing war paint. Yet in his weakness, there was something almost noble, a dignity that suffering had refined rather than destroyed. Thiago of the Thunder Spears, Jaguar rasped, his voice like wind through dead leaves, like the whisper of ghosts calling from the spirit world. The spirits have a sense of humor, bringing you home now when the world needs healing more than killing, when wisdom must triumph over strength. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. Thiago raised his war club, every fiber of his being screaming for vengeance. 8 years of hatred, 8 years of training, 8 years of dreaming about this exact moment, and now fate had delivered his enemy to him when he was too weak to even stand. It would be so easy. One strike. Justice for his brother, for his family, for everyone this monster had destroyed. Do it. Jaguar wheezed, not even trying to defend himself, his arms hanging limp at his sides in complete surrender. Take your revenge. I deserve it 1,000 times over for what I did to your family, for the pain I caused, for the hatred I planted in your heart like poison seeds. But something in the old warrior's eyes stopped Thiago's hand. Not fear, which he had expected to see and had dreamed of witnessing for 8 long years. Not defiance, which he had prepared for and knew how to answer with steel and fury. Instead, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. Hope mixed with profound sadness, the look of a man who had discovered terrible truths too late to matter. You know why I'm still alive, don't you? Jaguar continued, his words punctuated by violent coughing fits that brought up blood. Why the spirits kept me breathing when everyone else died screaming in agony, when strong warriors and wise elders fell like leaves in a storm. Thiago's grip tightened on his weapon until his knuckles turned white. Enlighten me before I send you to join them in the spirit world. Wait, don't miss this detail that changes everything. Jaguar reached into a leather pouch at his side with hands that trembled from weakness, withdrawing a collection of dried plants and roots that Thiago recognized immediately. Rare medicinal herbs from the deep forest, plants that took skilled shamans months to gather, plants that could cure diseases no other medicine could touch. The plague came from the white man's boats, Jaguar whispered. They brought it upriver, and it spread from tribe to tribe like wildfire, consuming dry grass. But my people, we had dealt with their diseases before. We knew which plants could fight them, which combinations of roots and bark could drive the sickness from the blood. Thiago's world tilted on its axis. You have the cure. Had, Jaguar corrected, holding up the small collection of herbs like a priest displaying sacred relics. This is all that's left after treating my own people, before they joined the ancestors in the great beyond. Enough to save perhaps a dozen lives, maybe 20, if we're careful with the dosage and the spirits smile upon our efforts. I've been keeping myself alive with tiny amounts, rationing it like water in the desert, waiting. His voice trailed off as another coughing fit seized him. Waiting for what? Thiago's voice was barely above a whisper, afraid to hear the answer that might shatter his world even further. Jago's eyes locked onto his, and Thiago saw something that made his stomach clench with dread and terrible understanding. Waiting for you to come home, Thunder Spear warrior. Because this cure, it only works if it's administered by someone the spirits trust completely. Someone pure, someone who hasn't been touched by the plague, whose spiritual energy hasn't been corrupted by the white man's disease, whose hands can still channel the healing power of the forest gods. What you've seen so far is nothing compared to what comes next. The medicine lodge fell silent except for the crackling of the small fire and the sound of 2 men breathing, one dying from disease that ate him from the inside, the other dying from the weight of an impossible choice that threatened to crush his soul. Outside, the wind carried new sounds that made both men's heads turn toward the entrance, the sound of approaching voices, weak and desperate, calling for help in languages Thiago recognized from trade gatherings and peace councils. Survivors from other villages, drawn by the smoke of the fire, hoping against hope to find salvation in the ruins of the Tikusana settlement. There are others, Jaguar confirmed, reading his expression with the skill of a man who had spent decades reading enemies' intentions in their eyes. Maybe 30, maybe 40 people from 5 different tribes, all dying, all looking for someone to save them from a death more terrible than any warrior's blade. He paused, another coughing fit racking his frame like lightning splitting a tree. The spirits chose you, Thiago. You alone among all the warriors of all the tribes have returned untouched by plague or corruption. The question is, will you choose them over your thirst for my blood? Thiago stared at the herbs, understanding flooding through him like cold river water. The cure existed, but it required someone untouched by the plague to prepare and administer it, someone who could walk among the dying without fear of infection, someone the spirits would accept as pure. But the price? You want me to save you, Thiago said slowly, each word tasting like poison on his tongue. The man who murdered my brother, who destroyed my family, who turned me into a killer. I want you to save them, Jaguar corrected, nodding toward the voices growing closer outside. The children who remind you of your sister's babies, the elders who carry the stories of their people, the mothers who sing lullabies in languages that will die with them if you let hatred win. But you won't believe what the real price of salvation actually is. Jaguar's next words hit Thiago like a war club to the chest, each syllable carrying the weight of spiritual law that had governed their peoples for countless generations. The cure requires a binding ritual, an oath of servitude sealed in blood and witnessed by the forest spirits themselves. Whoever prepares the medicine must swear to serve the one who provides it for 1 full year, 12 full cycles of the moon, through dry season and flood, through feast and famine, through victories and defeats. He paused to let the words sink in like poison arrows finding their mark, watching as comprehension dawned in Thiago's eyes like a terrible sunrise. It's the spirit's way of ensuring the cure isn't misused, that it goes only to those who truly need it, and not to those who would profit from others' suffering. The healing power demands sacrifice, demands humility, demands that pride be set aside for the greater good of all living things. The full horror of the situation crashed down on Thiago like a collapsing Brazil nut tree, massive and unstoppable. To save the survivors, to save innocent children who reminded him of his nephew, grieving mothers who carried the pain he knew too well, wise elders whose stories would die with them, he would have to swear fealty to his family's killer. He would have to serve the man whose death he had dreamed about for 8 years, whose blood he had sworn to spill in honor of his murdered brother. He would have to put aside every instinct for vengeance, every burning need for justice that had sustained him through countless battles, and become the willing servant of his greatest enemy. The irony was so profound it felt like the gods themselves were laughing at his fate. 1 year, Jaguar repeated, watching understanding dawn in Thiago's eyes. 12 full moons of service. You heal the sick, you protect the survivors, you help rebuild what the plague destroyed, and you do it all in my name, as my sworn warrior. Outside, a child's cry split the air, weak with sickness but still fighting to live, still believing that salvation might come from somewhere, somehow, still trusting in a world that had already betrayed them. The sound pierced straight through Thiago's heart, like an obsidian spear point, reminding him of his own nephew's voice during their last conversation, of all the innocent lives that hung in the balance of his decision, like fruit on a dying tree. More voices joined the first, an old woman singing death songs in the ancient tongue, her voice cracking with grief as she tried to give comfort to those who had none. A young father begging the spirits to spare his daughter, promising anything, everything, in exchange for her life, his wealth, his strength, his own years of life, if only she could live to see another sunrise. Warriors from proud tribes reduced to whispered prayers, their strength gone, their pride stripped away by disease that cared nothing for reputation, or achievements, or the number of enemies they had slain. A teenage girl called out for water in the Singu dialect, her voice so weak it barely carried on the wind. An elder from the Kayapo tribe, enemies of his own people, gasped prayers to ancestors who seemed deaf to his pleas. A mother cradled what might have been her last living child, humming lullabies that mixed tears with melody. These were not faceless enemies or strangers, they were people, reduced to their most basic humanity by suffering that recognized no tribal boundaries. You won't believe it, but the most shocking twist is still coming. Thiago looked at his war club, the weapon that had defined him, that had made him feared across 3 river systems, that carried the spiritual power of his ancestors, then at the dying man who held salvation in his poisoned hands, then at the entrance where desperate survivors waited for a miracle they didn't even know was possible. Every principle he lived by, every vow of vengeance he had sworn over his brother's grave, every reason he had for existing in a world that had taken everything from him, all of it balanced against the simple, terrible mathematics of survival. Save his enemy to save his people, serve the killer to become the healer, choose between personal justice and collective salvation. The voices outside grew more numerous, more desperate, children calling for their mothers in languages that would die if no one survived to speak them, elders praying to spirits who seemed to have abandoned them all, warriors from proud tribes reduced to begging for help they didn't expect to receive. Jaguar watched him struggle, and for the first time since Thiago had entered the lodge, something like compassion flickered in the old warchief's eyes. Not the compassion of weakness, but the understanding that comes from having faced impossible choices in a world that offers no easy answers. I know what I'm asking of you, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had killed many but understood the true cost of death. I know what it costs to set aside everything you believe, everything you've lived for. But look around you, young warrior. Look at what hatred has built. Look at what vengeance has accomplished. Thiago did look at the ashes of his village, where generations of his people had lived and loved and raised their children in peace. at the bones of his family, whose only crime had been existing in a world where different tribes were taught to see each other as enemies, rather than fellow human beings struggling to survive in an unforgiving land. At the wasteland that centuries of tribal warfare had created, leaving everyone vulnerable to diseases and disasters that cared nothing for ancient feuds or family honor. The Portuguese had brought the plague, but the endless cycle of revenge had ensured that no tribe was strong enough to stand against it when it came. His hand slowly released its grip on the war club, the obsidian weapon falling to the earthen floor with a sound like thunder in the silence, like the breaking of chains that had bound him to hatred for so long. The weapon that had defined him, that had made him a legend among warriors, now lay powerless at his feet, just carved stone and leather, no match for the weight of compassion that suddenly filled his heart. 1 year, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, each word tasting like ashes and broken dreams, like the death of everything he had thought he wanted. 1 year of service, 1 year of healing instead of killing, 1 year of building instead of destroying. 1 year, Jaguar confirmed, and in his eyes Thiago saw not victory, but the same terrible sadness that filled his own heart, the recognition that sometimes survival requires sacrificing everything that makes life worth living. Just when they thought the bargain was struck, the sound of Portuguese voices began echoing through the forest, voices shouting in the language of the colonizers, voices that carried news of an enemy far greater than any tribal war had ever produced, voices speaking of slave ships anchored in hidden coves, of conquistadors marching inland with steel weapons and gunpowder, of a European empire that sought to claim the entire Amazon as its own, voices that would force sworn enemies to become true allies in a fight for the very survival of the Amazon itself, and everything their ancestors had died to protect. The forest held its breath as the foreign words grew closer, carrying with them the sound of metal boots on forest paths and the jangle of armor that had never been forged by indigenous hands. Both men realized that their personal war had just become irrelevant in the face of a threat that would either unite all the tribes or see them all enslaved in chains of European steel. The Portuguese expedition was not just exploring, they were claiming territory, mapping river routes for slave raids, and establishing the foundation for a colonial empire that would consume everything in its path like a plague more deadly than any disease. Outside, the sound of European voices mixed with the cries of the sick, creating a symphony of desperation that seemed to embody the collision of two worlds, one dying of disease, the other dying of greed for gold and souls to harvest. The choice Thiago had just made would determine not just who lived or died from the plague, but who would be free to resist the coming storm of colonization that threatened to wash over the Amazon like a flood of steel and gunpowder and crosses blessed by a foreign god who demanded the destruction of all other ways of believing.